This week on the All-American Legacy podcast.
So this was the military aid to President Roosevelt, and he wanted to know about airborne operations. So this colonel hands Major Bill Lee the phone and says, tell this man everything he wants to know.
As they expand the Army and start to build the 99 Infantry Divisions, the 82nd's called up and sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana as a standard infantry division at the time.
The first jump from an aircraft in flight for the test platoon happened on August 16th, 1940.
18 men in 10 seconds, their first jump.
And then in 1942, of course, we were reorganized in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as the Airborne Division.
When they told us we were the best damn fighting outfit in the world, we believed it. All we had to do was to prove it.
This is the 82nd Airborne Division, fearless among fighting units.
From Fort Bragg, home of the Airborne and the center of the military universe, this is the All-American Legacy podcast. An inside look at the 100-year history of the 82nd.
They are all American, all the way.
Hello and welcome back to the All-American Legacy podcast. I'm your host, Staff Sergeant Will Rainier, and today is the day. Today is the episode that so many of you have been waiting on. This is the one that we've heard about over and over again. Can't wait until we discuss how the 82nd came to become the 82nd Airborne Division. Joining me for the first part of our show is Sergeant First Class Alex Burnett. Sergeant, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very exciting episode for us.
It is. We've definitely we've done a lot of research on this one.
Yeah, so World War I was great. If you haven't listened to those episodes, go back and check those out. The stories of Lieutenant Colonel Emory J. Pike and Sergeant Alvin York, both of our World War I Medal of Honor recipients, are very good, but this is something different.
This is something different. We're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about how the Airborne first came into existence, all the way back into the history, and then we're going to talk about how it came to the 82nd Airborne Division.
Yeah, so bring us back all the way back before 1942 when the 82nd actually was reconstituted as an airborne division, and talk to us a little bit about the history of using airborne in a military sense.
The concept of using airborne for military tactics was actually birthed somewhere far away from the United States. In a place that you wouldn't expect necessarily. It was born in Russia. They were the first ones to use airborne technology in order to further their military. The exact dates and times are hard to pin down because record keeping back then was not the best. But we know that in the 1920s, Russia had a fairly advanced airborne program, and they were doing demonstrations of paratroopers landing during training exercises. It's also worth noting that in the same time period, the Polish military, now very prominent partners of the 82nd Airborne Division, also had a fairly advanced airborne concept, but not as advanced as the Russians.
So we got it from the Russians?
Not quite. So during some of these tactics, what they used to call maneuvers, a German by the name of Kurt Student saw the Russians doing an airborne operation, and he brought this concept back to Germany, and that's how the German Fallschirmjäger, or paratrooper, was born. Now, fast forward just a little bit more, and an American by the name of William Lee, last known as Major General William Lee, sees Germans conducting airborne operations, and he thinks this is something that he can bring and use in the American military.
So obviously the Germans must have thought this was a very successful technique, otherwise, we wouldn't have tried to take it from them.
Yes and no. The Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, were considered ferocious in their ability to land in place and seize an objective. And they had a lot of success early in the war. The first known combat jump was on April 9th, 1940, when German paratroopers did their first combat jump, seizing the Aalborg airport in Denmark. However, less than a year later, the Germans had a successful airborne operation when they tried to seize the island of Crete. The problem is that the German paratroopers suffered such heavy losses that Hitler dictated in May 1941 that the German paratroopers would no longer conduct airborne operations. They would just be used as elite infantry.
So here in America, Major at the time, William Lee, how is he kind of researching this out or trying to flesh this idea out so that we can use it for the American forces?
At the time, Major William Lee was in Washington, D.C., working at the Office of the Chief of the Infantry. And he's continuing to research, and he listens to the various intelligence reports about the Germans and their airborne operations. It almost becomes an obsession for him, and that's all he talks about in the office. So much so that a colonel that he was working with gave him a standing direct order not to talk about airborne operations.
And then, so how did, I mean, obviously it didn't end there, so what happened?
So there's a story that's actually told to me by the fine folks at the Airborne Museum up in Dunn, North Carolina, which is where Bill Lee is from. And one day this colonel gets a phone call, and it's someone asking about airborne operations.
After he's given the direct order not to talk about it.
Exactly. And he literally says, well, who wants to know? And the guy on the other side says, well, this is the Office of the President of the United States. So this was the military aide to President Roosevelt. And he wanted to know about airborne operations. So this colonel hands Major Bill Lee the phone and says, tell this man everything he wants to know.
That's awesome. So he essentially gets the green light to start exploring this idea. And one of the things that we know is that to help kind of flesh this out and figure it out, he actually went out to the Pacific Northwest and studied the Smokejumpers that were already out there using airborne operations to jump in and fight forest fires.
That is correct. He did a lot of research, including, like you said, the Smokejumpers. Another place that he went in order to find an interesting way to help paratroopers train was the New York State Fair.
And what was going on at the New York State Fair?
So at the time, the New York State Fair had a parachute stand. It was a 250-foot tower, and people could go up in it in almost a bucket seat, and it would drop them in pairs of one or two.
It sounds kind of familiar. If anyone has been to the airborne school in the U.S. Army Airborne School at Fort Benning, they've probably seen something that looks very similar.
Yes, they have. We have 3 now still at Fort Benning. There were 4. One got blown over by a tornado. But there was a company in New Jersey that had made these towers, and the U.S. Army purchased 4 of them to help paratroopers train.
Next, he drops from a 200-foot tower in a parachute chair. He gets an idea of height and view. And the sensation of coming down quickly. Now he is closer to the real thing.
So now we have this idea, we have this training area. What's next?
So the actual American Airborne Force was born on June 26, 1940, when we established a Parachute Test Platoon. These were volunteers. They were handpicked from the 29th Infantry Regiment, and their training originally began in an abandoned hangar at Fort Benning, Georgia. Major Bill Lee has gotten himself promoted to lieutenant colonel. And he's still watching. He's not in direct control of these troopers, but he's still watching their training. And he actually calls this little group up to New York, and they trained for about 2 weeks on these 250-foot towers. That was their first exposure to actually falling with a deployed canopy. They go back to Georgia. They continue to learn how to essentially fall, doing everything from jumping from concrete barriers, like you would see for those of us who have been in airborne school or have been to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, jumping off small platforms, learning how to roll with the way they land, to jumping out of moving 5-ton trucks in order to get the shock of landing at a certain speed. All of this is happening, but there's still no established airborne school yet. That doesn't happen for a little while longer.
So they're doing all this training, and then eventually they're going to jump for real, right? When did that happen?
So the first jump from an aircraft in flight for the test platoon happened on August 16th, 1940. And First Lieutenant William Ryder, Private William King, became the first officer and enlisted paratroopers in U.S. history.
And today we recognize August 16th as National Airborne Day, a big event. There's usually parades or ceremonies around, especially some of the airborne units here at Fort Bragg.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. About 2 weeks after the first airborne op, the first mass jump was conducted on Fort Benning.
Stand up. the order from the jump master. Hook static lines. Jump. 18 men in 10 seconds. Their first jump.
With that jump, the U.S. Army Airborne School was born.
So we've got a full platoon of paratroopers, the first test platoon of paratroopers, and so now we need to fast forward to the entry into World War II, and to help us do that, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Joe Bacino and John Arson, the curator of the 82nd Airborne Division War Memorial Museum, to talk about something that we were ready to take this concept and use it in the European theater.
So the division was brought back out of the reserves into the active component for World War II, and initially was just going to remain as an infantry division.
Correct. The 82nd Airborne Division was stood up or brought back to active duty in 1942 as the Army started to expand. What's unique is it had no soldiers at that time because all the soldiers had already been mobilized as individuals in 1941 for a year. Their mobilization was supposed to end at the end of December of 1941. And of course, we know that didn't happen. So as they expand the Army and start to build the 99 Infantry Divisions, the 82nd's called up and sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as a standard infantry division of the time. So it was a triangular division with 3 regiments. So the 320, the old 328th was inactivated, and so it arrived at Camp Claiborne with the 326th. 327th and the 325th, of course, which we all know is still with us today.
So why was the division, when was the decision made to transition the 82nd to an airborne division, and why was that decision made?
Of course, the airborne capability was being developed by the School of Infantry at Fort Benning. The force at Fort Benning they already had several battalions stood up, and they were getting ready to activate the 1st Airborne Regiment. And as they studied the other airborne doctrine of other countries, they started to really look towards the Germans. German doctrine is what drove a lot of the early airborne thinking in the United States. The doctrine at the time was still being developed, so you had a lot of struggle both with General Marshall and others on how to use an airborne division, whether it be used in a tactical sense or a strategic sense, but they knew they needed that capability.
And then in 1942, of course, we were reorganized in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as the Airborne Division.
The 82nd Infantry Division was chosen because Omar Bradley and Major General Ridgway were great trainers.
Next, you give them top flight generals. Omar Bradley, who took over in March 1942 and taught us how to fight on the ground. Matt Ridgway, who came after him in June and showed us how to fight from the air. Yeah, they gave us the best in leaders. And we had a rough time keeping up with them. They trained us. Brother, how they trained us. With run and jump and climb and crawl, calisthenics, rifle range, shoot school, glider loading, practice jumps, crash landings. We took it for weeks and months. Training is continuous, the brass said. Continuous. Hell, it lasted from Fort Benning to North Africa, from Louisiana to the Sahara.
The division had been manned and had been trained on most of its collective task up to and past the battalion level. So of the called up Army Reserve divisions, it was one of the most ready and best trained. And the other idea is that they wanted to convert one of the reserve divisions primarily because they were full of reserve officers. These officers had not been trained in standard infantry tactics for the most part. They weren't career Army officers who thought their careers were best served serving in like a standard infantry.
When they told us we were the best damn fighting outfit in the world, we believed it. All we had to do was to prove it.
Was there also a notion that if this didn't work out, the division could quickly kind of go back to some other kind of doctrine or some other kind of formation?
As you looked at some of these other specialized divisions in the Army, most of these had also come out of the Army Reserve. And so, but it took quite a while to convert them back once the decision was made to convert those back. So part of what the driving force, I also believe, is that because the 82nd with Omar Bradley and General Ridgway were so great trainers that if the concept didn't work, this division could be converted back to become a standard infantry division. Because again, it was all about getting these infantry divisions into the battle and into the fight quickly. So the 82nd could be reconverted if it didn't work.
With Allied successes on all fronts, the training of paratroops continues with increasing intensity. These men are all volunteers, and the Army is now accepting men from every branch of the service who can pass the rigid mental and physical tests to become paratroopers.
Sometime in September and went over to the frying pan area, where they put all the new recruits for airborne training. And I went through jump school there, A stage, B stage, C stage, D stage, and then in October, third week of October, I finished jump school. You make your 5 jumps, you pack your own chute, and you jump with that for the 5 jumps. And the last jump, it was a night jump.
After parachute school, they were forming the 82nd Airborne Division. And after we were formed into our groups or companies, battalions, and so on, we then were sent up to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which was and it remains today the home of the 82nd.
There's no outfit quite like the paratroops, the daredevils who ride down on silk. Paratroopers were the first to land in Normandy. There they proved their worth beyond question. Paratroops will continue to play a leading part in the Allies' global fight to victory.
When I turned around and looked, there wasn't a soul left in the plane. I'm all by myself. So I just ran down the plane as fast as I could and went out the door. I didn't jump the way they told me to. I just got out the door. I wanted to get out of there. So when I landed, I'm all by myself. And I've got a M1 rifle, and it's in a packed dirt chute right across here. Well, when I got on the ground, all I wanted to do was get my gun out so I could protect myself. That's all I could think of. I was saying, dear God, just let me get my rifle out. Well, he did. I got it out.
Those are some of the voices of the Army's original paratroopers. So back again with Sergeant First Class Burnett. Sergeant Burnett, kind of talk to me a little bit about what it was like for those paratroopers in the early ages of the U.S. Army Airborne School.
Would-be paratroopers who are going through the now well-established jump school at Fort Benning had to go through a 4-week course. Now, for those of us who go through now, it's turned into a 3-week course, ground week, tower week, and then jump week. Back then, it was structured into stages: A stage, B stage, C stage, and then D stage. This course was more designed to separate paratroopers from what would be normal soldiers, and it was a very rigorous course. All of the information that I've read showed that these, what we would now know as black hats back then, were the airborne instructors, were merciless when it came to physically testing these, again, would-be paratroopers. And it didn't matter who you were, enlisted, officer, when you came to airborne school, you were all the same until jump week. So they were going through their maneuvers, learning how to jump, how to rig up their parachutes, because back then you had to rig your own parachute. And then they get to D stage, which is where they're going to actually jump out of an aircraft in flight. And the difference here is where the normal enlisted men would go through and they would only rig 1 parachute per night, the officers had to rig 2, because the following day they were going to start learning how to be jump masters, because these are the guys that were going to be pushing their paratroopers out of the airplane.
So 4 weeks of jump school, but these guys weren't going through as individuals, so they were going through as complete units. So once they graduated, they really were a cohesive unit. They'd been through all of this, spent all this time together, and that had to do really, really good things for the cohesion and what it would take for them to go over to Europe and make those jumps.
Absolutely. Actually, one of the best stories from that time period is from a regiment that is now in our 3rd Brigade, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, who had been training at the time under Colonel Jim Gavin, Jumpin' Jim Gavin, a legend around here. And the 505th, who had trained together from day one, gone through jump school together, even when they were added to the 82nd Airborne Division, when entertainers would come through or they would do morale events, they'd say, "Hey, aren't you guys 82nd?" They said, "No, we're 505th." And that was their allegiance. That was how tight they were knit from these shared experiences.
So these units are training together. They are essentially becoming a family, which would benefit them greatly as they transition over to the European front and begin to train for these combat jumps. Lieutenant Colonel Joe Bacino, one of the hosts of this show, talked to Dan Carlin, host of the hit podcast Hardcore History, about some of the context and really the importance of the 82nd and America as a whole getting involved in the war in Europe in the 1940s.
Go look at the public opinion polls and the Gallup polls. I mean, people didn't want to go deal with those European crises and had figured that they had learned their lesson from the First War. I mean, were people scared of Hitler, and was there a natural affinity, say, for the Allies? There was, but not enough of an affinity for someone to suggest that we get involved in the conflict. I mean, Roosevelt, if anyone recalls, had run on a promise, and a real promise. It was not just a side comment. It was a full-throated promise to keep, American boys out of the war. Well, that was the campaign right before the war. So obviously public opinion was in that place, or the guy who won the White House wouldn't have been running on a no-involvement platform. So, but obviously things like Pearl Harbor will change your mind quickly.
Then in 1942, we had to, very quickly stand up this division again, and then had to very quickly develop this airborne capability, train people to do this, and then just like in World War I, and then very quickly move over to Europe and enter the war. It's something that there was a real parallel, in terms of getting that training capability and getting the division and getting American forces into the fight there.
And the whole learning curve has to be done all over again. As you said, the airborne learning curve is not even like a relearning things. It's a completely new skill that they were putting together. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I always think about that. There are people in the 82nd Airborne Division here now, right now today, that have 70 training jumps, 80, 90, 100. Some people have more than 100, but 70, 80, 90 training jumps. They do this all the time. And when in Operation Husky, when the 82nd jumped into Sicily, for many of those paratroopers, that was their 4th time doing it, or their 3rd time doing it. They'd done it maybe once in the United States. They'd done it once in Europe, mobilizing, or in North Africa, mobilizing, getting ready to go into Sicily, and then that was their 3rd jump, or in some cases their 4th if they did two of them in North Africa. So really brand new thing, a terrifying thing in many ways if you read some of the diaries and the narratives, and something that they were able to accomplish. But really, in the context of what we do now and the way we think about airborne operations, it's bizarre to think that this was their 4th or 5th jump.
Well, and what's so different about the American experience in the 2 world wars that we have not experienced militarily in quite some time is that, it's been a long time since we've gone up against forces that were our equal, or maybe in some cases even better than we were. You look at arriving on the European shores in either world war, and at the time you're running against armies that, as you said, are more experienced, better equipped, especially in the Second World War when the first U.S. forces run into the first German forces in places like North Africa. You're running into well-trained, really well-equipped troops. And that's a real test. It's one thing to go in there with a superiority. I mean, if you're a British colonial soldier and you're fighting tribal troops in India somewhere, you're worried about numbers and whatnot, but you're not worried about being outgunned. When American forces show up in places like North Africa in the Second World War and you run into German tanks and stuff like that, that puts the U.S. in a position it hasn't been in some time, and you really have to come up with, the Americans had such a reputation for innovation and battlefield improvisation, but if you're dealing with a Sherman tank, not even Sherman tank in North Africa, but I mean a Lee or a Grant tank, and you're running up against Panzer IIIs with a 50-millimeter gun, you're going to improvise because you're not going to have a lot of options. So, I mean, you couldn't just call in the cavalry back then. The Americans weren't always up to the fighting standard that the highest units in Europe were when the wars first started. And not only did they have to learn on the fly, but sometimes in order to be effective, they had to improvise, try new things. And the paratroops are a perfect example of something that, you had to be willing to spend lives to learn. I mean, dropping a bunch of people in Italy without a lot of drops already, you're going to lose a lot more people than you would if you sat there and trained meticulously for a long time, but you don't always have that luxury. And I think that's a perfect example of people learning on the fly, literally, if you'll pardon the pun.
Staff Sergeant Will Rainier here once again with Sergeant First Class Alex Burnett. And so, Sergeant Burnett, what we see here is these combat jumps really would kind of lay the framework for the legacy of the 82nd Airborne Division. It may have only been 4 years from the reconstitution into the 82nd Airborne to the end of World War II, but those 4 years out of our 100-year history really would come to define the All-American Division.
It really does, and for folks who have been to Fort Bragg, who have been to the division footprint, our buildings, our streets, our entire area is almost defined by those 4 years. Ardennes Street, the various memorials we have to Charles de Glopper, who was one of our Medal of Honor recipients. If you look into our conference rooms, are named after Nijmegen, after Sicily, Salerno. It really is a huge part of our history.
And so as we move forward from World War II to today, it really is going to be that airborne legacy that drives a lot of the things that we do in Grenada and Panama and these places where, we have jumped or maybe not jumped, like the Dominican Republic, or, on our way to go jump. And, it really is the legacy that was forged there in World War II with this airborne capability really just come to mean so much to the All-American Division. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode. This is really kind of the foundation for the rest of the episodes. We're going to be talking about the airborne legacy in the past 75 years so much over the next couple of episodes, and we hope you'll join us here on the All-American Legacy podcast. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. Sergeant First Class Alex Burnett, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Pacino, Dan Carlin, host of the hit podcast Hardcore History, and John Arson of the 82nd War Memorial Museum. And we especially want to thank the Airborne Museum in Dunn, North Carolina. Sergeant Burnett, you spent a lot of time out there researching for this episode.
I really did. I really want to thank the entire staff up there. And if you're in North Carolina, around the Fayetteville area, it's only a half-hour drive to Dunn. And you can really get a feel for not just how the American paratrooper was born, but even how airborne operations were born in the rest of the world.
Remember, you can download the All-American Legacy podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. We're on YouTube. Anywhere you find podcasts, you'll be able to find us. So make sure you download it, leave a review and a rating. Both of those things help other people find the podcast, and send this to a friend. I know that there are plenty of Army veterans or even people who served in the 82nd that would love to hear what it is that we have to say about the All-American Legacy. So from the All-American Legacy podcast, I'm Staff Sergeant Will Rainier, and we'll see you next week.